Molto contenti di avervi qui, tra l'altro ci sono sempre.
Welcome. It's a great pleasure having you all here, as often the seats in the front rows are pretty empty. It's always been like that. But anyway, no seats are reserved. So if you're sitting in the back or if you're standing, feel free to come to the front and sit down in the first rows so that you can follow this next event. Now, I have to tell you that it's a great pleasure. I am very happy to see that Mr. Eric Maskin has accepted our invitation. Our audience, the Squirrel audience, already had the great privilege 2 years ago to listen to Eric Maskin on hyperbolic discounting, that is to say our trend that we have to delay and postpone and put off. If you remember, it was a memorable presentation, and for those of you who did not have the opportunity to listen to it a couple of years ago, well, it is still available on the website, and you can have a look at the slides and you can listen to the event in streaming mode. Now, you may remember that 2 years ago, he had been introduced by Sandro Brusco, so I don't want to dwell upon things that were already told, but he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007, and he was awarded when he was living in the Einstein building. Now, I don't know whether there's a direct link or not between the fact that he was living in the same house where Albert Einstein lived. But I am not aware of other people who lived in that house and then were awarded the Nobel Prize. But anyway, there's something else that somebody told me yesterday on the way to Trento, and which is distinctive of Eric Maskin. That is that during the Halloween celebration, he used to dress up as Einstein. Maybe it was in an effort to increase the likelihood of being awarded the award. Anyway, this was just a joke. Eric Maskin contributed very, very much to the theory of economics with the theory of the design of mechanisms, of which Sandro Brusco spoke a lot 2 years ago. And Sandro Brusco studied this theory in depth, but Professor Maskin also contributed with several different theories, especially with the theory of games. And in particular, there's a specific contribution, so it is not an award for the career, but looking at the CV, at the resume of Eric Maskin, we can see that he really wrote over 122 papers and publications on top-level scientific magazines and books. Just to give you an idea, that it is very difficult to publish on those magazines. When you want to recruit PhD students abroad, usually there is a span of time, usually 6 or 7 years, in which these scholars are recruited and they work at university, and only after 6 or 7 years it is then decided whether they are given a tenure or not. Now, giving a tenure or not, you should have at least one paper in one of the top publications or journals of the sector. Now, 7 years for one. With Mr. Maskin, we have over 122. It would take an average person, it would take like over 700 years of life to have the same productivity as Professor Maskin. His research has always been focused on the need to promote incentives. When you delegate some authority to third parties, so there is no direct decision, but there is a relationship between main agent, and you have to give incentives so that these people behave and behave properly. Well, this theory, this approach is fundamental to tackle the fundamental problems that we are dealing with this year's event. So we are here to discuss about the ruling class, how to improve the rules that have to complied with by the ruling class. And since we are delegating responsibility to the persons in command, to our representatives, I mean, we are in a democracy, so we cannot decide independently. Inevitably, we end up delegating some of our powers, with few exceptions like Switzerland, where people are called upon through referendums and can have a direct say on some specific things, but usually we are in representative democracies whereby the authority are entrusted with a part of our power. And when we delegate, we need rules and we need specific schemes so that the people that are given these powers will for sure pursue the common good and the common welfare. This is the title of this year's Festival of Economics. And it's one of the topics that has always been at the center of Eric Maskin's works. Today he will focus on accountability, dealing with public officials, the ruling class. There is the problem of accountability, and Professor Maskin will tell us how true and how important it is that there is accountability up to a certain level, because an excessive accountability may be counterproductive. If these people are made too accountable, they may actually forget about the needs of minorities because they have to make the majority happy. And at the same time, they cannot simply be like followers that follow just general trends or general fads. Now, this may sound a bit abstract, but there is a lot. There are many practical implications, and he will now be given the floor for 45 minutes. And then, of course, he will be more than ready to reply to some of your questions. I know, and then this event will close at 6 and 15 minutes, so that there is time to go to the following debate. So, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Tito, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back in Trento. It's a great pleasure to be back in this magnificent room. So as Tito said, the subject of my talk today is how accountable public officials should be. And I should say that what I'm going to be talking about is actually based on some research that I've done in collaboration with the French economist Jean Tirole. I don't have to tell you that the idea behind democratic government is that public decisions that are taken on behalf of the entire society should reflect what people in that society actually want. But with a few exceptions, and Tito mentions direct referenda as are conducted in Switzerland, it's rare that decisions are taken directly by the public. Usually what happens is that we, the public, delegate the authority to take public decisions to representatives, to government officials. And there's a good reason for that. After all, these representatives are spending basically all their time on governing. It's expected that they will have the expertise, the knowledge, and the incentive to act carefully and with due consideration for the public welfare. After all, individual citizens, particularly in a large in a large country, have very little effect on public decisions. An individual citizen only will have a tiny effect on an overall outcome, and therefore individual citizens don't have typically much incentive to learn about the issues at hand in detail. The famous economist Joseph Schumpeter once said in his typically cynical way that citizens have about as much interest, as much incentive to master a political problem, actually less incentive to put into considering a political question than they do playing a game of bridge. So it's understandable that citizens will want to delegate the authority to make public decisions to representatives. But what gives representatives the incentive to act, to take good decisions, to act well on behalf of the public? Well, I'm going to suppose that there are two motivations. The first is that public officials do want to be remembered favorably. They want to have a legacy that future generations will look back on. But we know that this legacy motivation is not always sufficient to induce officials to act on behalf of citizens. And that's why in democratic societies we often require officials to be reevaluated periodically. That is, we insist that they run for re-election or that they at least be reevaluated for reappointments. In other words, we want to make them accountable for their decisions. And the reason why that works, why running for re-election provides motivation to officials, is because officials want to hold office. There are advantages to holding office that private citizens don't have. So these are the two motivations that I will consider: the desire to leave a legacy, the desire to hold office, to be re-elected. Now, you might ask, well, why doesn't re-election, requiring re-election, provide sufficient incentive to get officials to do the right thing? There are, of course, some advantages to requiring officials to run for re-election. One is that an official may be looking ahead to the next election, and an official might try to do things that will please the public, and that may induce him to make good decisions. And if he makes bad decisions, well, the public has the opportunity to kick him out. If an official's own motives are not in line with what the public wants, they can vote for someone else. But there's a drawback to accountability. There's a drawback to the election system, which is, well, there are two of them that I want to mention today. The first is that if you're an official who wants to get reelected, you may simply take the popular way out. You know what the public wants, you do it, even if you understand that that decision is not in the long-term public interest. In other words, you may pander to public opinion just to get reelected. As I started by saying, the main reason we want representative government is because we think officials might do a better job making decisions than individual citizens. But if all of the officials are doing is pandering to public opinion, well, we're losing the main reason we wanted representative government in the first place. So that's a drawback of accountability. And the second drawback is that if the public is not a homogeneous body, if there are various minority interests, officials may not have the incentive to take into account these minority interests if they want to get reelected, because after all, it's a majority who are going to reelect these officials. So losing sight of minority interest is also a potential drawback of the election system. So if we were designing the rules for our society in an optimal way, we would want to take into account both the benefits and the drawbacks of accountability. Some decisions would be delegated to officials who are accountable, but perhaps some other decisions would be delegated to officials who are less accountable. And that's what I want to talk about today. In particular, I want to talk about three different ways of organizing governments, organizing public decisions. The first is the idea that goes back to ancient Greece, the idea of direct democracy, where the public decides directly what public policy should be. I'll call that direct democracy. The second is what I'll call representative democracy, where we give the power to decide to officials, and those officials are subject to re-election. And the third possibility is to give some decision-making power to officials who are not subject to re-election. I'll call this judicial power because in many countries, judges, who are after all public officials, are typically not subject to re-election. In the United States, for example, federal judges are appointed for life. And there may be a good reason for that. So those are the three possibilities, and I wanted to decide which, I want to look at the question of which decision should be decided by which of the, by the three alternatives that I've described: direct democracy, representative democracy, judicial power. And the considerations involved will be, first, how good is the public in figuring out on its own what the right decision is. In some cases, it seems perfectly all right to let the public decide directly. How good is the public at identifying officials who will act in their interest? An important question is, how much can we expect the public to learn after a public decision has been taken about how good that decision was, how much an official wants to be reelected is obviously important in deciding whether or not we should subject officials to re-election. And then finally, the extent to which society is homogeneous or heterogeneous, and by heterogeneous I mean made up of minority interests that may have to be protected. So those are the 5 considerations that will determine which decision should be allocated to which of the 3 possibilities that I have laid out for you. Now, this is an economics festival, and I'm an economist, and so what I'd like to do this afternoon is to show you a little bit about how an economist would go about analyzing this problem. And the way that we do this is by constructing a simplified version of reality, in other words, a model. And I'm going to lay out a little model for you, which will, I hope, shed some light on these issues. So here is the basic model. There are going to be 2 time periods, 2 decisions to be taken. In the first time period, someone is going to have to decide whether to choose A or B. And in the second period, there's a similar choice between A or B. I'm going to use A and B to describe the decisions in both periods, but they don't, A and B in the first period don't have to be the same as in the second period. In the first version of the model, I'm going to suppose that the public is homogeneous. So all citizens are the same, and so we don't have to worry about minority interests. Now, we'll suppose that every time a right decision is made, that's good for the public. The public gets a positive payoff from that correct decision. In fact, we'll suppose that the payoff is equal to 1. Economists like to quantify things, so we'll suppose that the public gets a payoff of 1 from each right decision and a payoff of 0 from each wrong decision. And in every period, we'll suppose that the public thinks that the probability that decision A is the correct choice is P. So the public doesn't know for sure what the right decision is. The probability that A is the right decision is some P, which is, it might be 60%, it might be 80%. We'll suppose that it's more than a half, more than 50%. So in other words, A is the popular choice. It's the choice that the public would make if it were up to the public to decide. And you can think of P, the probability that A is the right choice, as a measure of how much the public knows. If P is very close to 50%, then the public doesn't really know very much. A could be the right choice, B could be the right choice, the public doesn't really know. If P is close to 1, though, that's the case where the public really does know a lot. And perhaps that's the case where the public should be deciding directly what to do. Well, if the Constitution for our hypothetical country allocates the decision between A and B to the public, well, then the public will choose A because that's the popular choice. But if the Constitution specifies that an official makes the decision and the public chooses the official, then we'll suppose that the outcome depends on how likely it is that the official is acting in the interest of the public. Remember, I'm supposing that officials want to leave a legacy, but an official's idea of a good legacy may be very different from the public's idea of a good legacy. Well, suppose that there's some chance, a probability pi, that the official and the public think the same way, that the official and the public are congruent, but there's also a probability that the official's ideas of what is good for society are very different from what is in reality good for society. So there's a probability 1 minus pi that the official is non-congruent with the public. Now, we'll suppose that, that because officials specialize in making public decisions, they actually know what action is best for them and for society. The public only knows with probability p. Officials know with probability 1 what the right action is. That doesn't mean that they're going to take it because they may have different objectives, but they at least have the knowledge. We'll suppose that an official's payoff depends on the decision she takes. She gets a positive payoff from taking an action that she would like to take, and a 0 payoff from choosing the other action. She also gets a payoff from being in office. So we'll suppose that if the official makes the decision, then after the first period, where the official is chosen between A and B, the public finds out, not necessarily for certain, but with some probability, whether that first period decision was correct or not. So that's the probability Q, that the first period decision was correct. But with some probability, 1 minus Q, the public doesn't find out. Now, the value of Q, the probability that the public learns whether the first period decision is correct, will typically depend on things like how diligent the press is at providing information. The more independent and the more vigorous are journalists in a particular country, the more likely Q is to take a high value. Now, depending on who gets to make the decision, the first period official can either run for re-election, if that's what the Constitution requires, and if she loses, she'll be replaced by some other official, or if we're talking about non-accountable officials, who don't have to run for re-election, the official will stay in office and take a decision in the second period. So what I want to do is to analyze the outcomes of our three possibilities: direct democracy, representative democracy, and judicial power, and I want to evaluate them from the point of view of the payoffs that the public gets. And I want to look at two cases. The first case is where the public gets essentially no information about the quality of the first period decision. Sometimes we don't know for many years whether an official's decision was a good one or not. If we look particularly at long-term investments, it may be many years before we find out whether or not a particular bet on energy development was wise or not. So I want to look first at the case where the public doesn't get much information about the quality of the first period decision by the time an official is up for re-election. So in that case, if the public were choosing between A or B itself, everything would turn on the probability P that A is the right decision. Remember, I said that the public itself thinks that decision A is the right one, and the public is correct with probability P. So if everything were decided by direct democracy, the public would get a payoff of 1 times P in the first period. That's its expected payoff, its average payoff in the first period, and another 1 times P in the second period, for a total of 2P. So 2P is the payoff from direct democracy. What if we're looking at the case of judicial power, where an official is put into office for 2 periods, does not have to run for re-election? Well, then everything turns on the probability pi that the official is congruent with the public. Remember, the official knows what the right decision is, but may not have interests that are the same as the public's. The probability is pi that the official views things the same way that the public does, or wants to take the same decisions that the public would take if the public knew what the right decision was. And so in this case, the payoff to the public will be pi each period, or a total of 2 pi. And then the last case to consider is representative democracy, in which an official has to run for re-election after the first period. Now, in order to analyze representative democracy, we have to say, what is the primary motivation for an official? Does the official care mostly about her legacy or being re-elected? If she cares about being re-elected, which I will consider first, then she's going to choose the popular decision. In other words, she's going to pander to public opinion. She's going to choose A, because that will please the public, that will get her reelected. Now, once she's reelected, she can do what she wants. So in the second period, she will choose the decision which pleases her the most. So in the case of representative democracy, the public will get a payoff of P in the first period because the official will be pandering, and a payoff of pi the second period because in the second period the official will be doing what she wants, and the probability that that's good for the public is pi. Well, we've now looked at the payoffs for our 3 different forms of government, and we get 2p for direct democracy, 2 pi for judicial power, and p plus pi for representative democracy. Now, if you think about this for a little bit, you'll see that direct democracy or judicial power, one or the other of them must be better than representative democracy, because either P is bigger than pi, either direct democracy is better than representative democracy, or pi is bigger than P, in which case judicial power is better than representative democracy. So in the case where officials just want to get reelected and they don't care sufficiently about legacy, representative democracy is a bad idea. At least in this case where the public finds out very little about whether the first period decision was good or not. So basically it's a choice between judicial power or direct democracy. If pi is bigger than P, judicial power is better. If P is bigger than pi, direct democracy is better. But now I want to look at the case where an official is primarily motivated not by the desire to be reelected, but by how future generations will look back on that official, in other words, by her legacy. And now the analysis is quite different. Now an official will not pander to public opinion in the first period. She realizes she might not be reelected, but she cares mostly about but how she will be remembered once she leaves office. So in this case, she might choose decision A, but only if she thinks it's the best choice. So she'll be reelected if she chooses A. She'll be thrown out of office if she chooses B. And I'm not going to go through the math. Those of you who are interested in it can study it for yourself at your leisure. But I want to point out that now representative democracy will be better than judicial power. Under judicial power, where you appoint an official for 2 periods and can't get her out after the first period, there is a risk that you will appoint someone who is not taking decisions in the public interest. And there's nothing you can do about that. At least under representative democracy, you have some chance of identifying a non-congruent official. Now, you don't know for sure whether officials are congruent or non-congruent because the public doesn't know whether the decisions that these officials are making are actually good decisions or not. All they can do is evaluate officials by whether they're taking the popular decision or not, but at least the public has a chance of getting rid of an official who is non-congruent. And that means that representative democracy will lead to a higher payoff than judicial power. And so now we have a comparison of representative democracy with direct democracy, which gives representative democracy the edge in more cases. And judicial power is out of the picture altogether. Representative democracy is clearly going to be better than appointing an official for 2 periods without re-election. Now, when is it likely that this edge that representative democracy potentially has will actually be realized? Well, I would argue that for particularly important decisions, for decisions which are likely to have effects lasting many years, the legacy motive is probably going to be especially strong. So for important decisions, we're probably better off as a society assigning those decisions to politicians who have to run for re-election, because those are the ones, those are the sorts of officials who are likely to both care about legacy and be congruent with what society wants, because the public has the opportunity of getting rid of the politician after the first period, but not the judge, not the official who's in office for 2 periods. So important decisions should be assigned to politicians who are subject to re-election. Now, I've been assuming to this point that officials' decisions are not learned to be correct or not, perhaps for many years. So in the analysis up to now, officials don't directly act in order to raise the payoff of the public. They act on their officials act on their own behalf because the public is not going to find out in time for the re-election whether or not the decision was correct or not. But I now want to turn to the case where the public might find out whether the first period decision was correct, and we'll see that this enriches the analysis. This complicates the analysis. So we'll suppose that with some probability, the public does learn whether the first period decision was correct, perhaps because journalists have studied the question and have reported their own analysis to the public. Now, direct democracy and judicial power are completely unaffected by the possibility that the public learns whether the first period decision was correct or not. But representative democracy is definitely affected by this possibility, and in fact, if there's a high enough probability that the public finds out whether the first period decision was correct or not, we now have a new possibility, which is what I'll call forward-looking pandering. Forward-looking pandering is where in the first period, the official chooses the right alternative because she knows that there's a reasonable probability that by the time she runs for re-election, the public will have discovered whether this first period decision was right or not. So she will do the right thing. Now, it's true that she's pandering, but she's not pandering to public opinion. She's pandering to informed analysis that she knows will be available by the time that she runs for re-election. So this is quite different from what I was calling pandering before. And in fact, with this kind of pandering, forward-looking pandering, officials will do the right thing regardless of their preferences. Now, that doesn't mean that they will be reelected, because it may still be the case that the public doesn't find out whether the decision was correct. Although I'm supposing that Q, the probability that the public finds out is positive, it still might not be 1. And so in that case, the public will re-elect the official only if the official took the decision the public initially thought was correct. In other words, the popular choice. So what I have shown you today is that there are 2 ways in which making public officials accountable might improve welfare, might improve the payoff that the public gets. If officials don't care that much about being reelected, they care more about their legacy, then officials will do what they think is right, and in this case, representative democracy is desirable because it gives the public a chance to throw out officials whose views of what is right may not be congruent with that of society. And when officials care mostly about getting reelected rather than legacy, we still might have good outcomes with representative democracy if the public has a reasonable chance of finding out by the time of re-election whether the public decisions were correct or not. So either way, with a weak re-election motive or a strong re-election motive, there are cases where representative democracy is good for public welfare. Let me talk very briefly about the case where the public may not be homogeneous. So I've been concentrating so far on a world where all voters are the same, all citizens are the same, but what if we can divide up the public between a majority and a minority? Let's look at a simple world where the majority knows what action is best for it, and the minority also knows which action is best for the minority group, but those actions are different. So the majority would like to take action A, the minority would like to take action B. And we'll suppose that some of the time it's proper for the majority's interests to outweigh the minorities, but with the remaining probability, we would like to give more weight to the minority. Well, how does this change the analysis? Well, now we should really think of there being three kinds of officials. There are officials who are congruent with the majority, there are officials who are congruent with the minority, and there are officials who are in between. They're congruent with some average of what majority wants and the minority wants. In other words, they're congruent with overall society. Now, under direct democracy, where we allow the citizens of society to make decisions directly, the majority always prevails. They outnumber the minority, so they always get their choice, which is outcome A. So under direct democracy, the minority's interests are completely ignored. Under judicial power, well, it's going to depend on what kind of official we have. Is this an official who's congruent with the majority, an official who's congruent with minority, or some combination? Under representative democracy, it will also depend on what kind of official we have. But now, officials have to run for re-election. And so now, we have a situation where officials who choose the popular action A get re-elected, officials who choose the unpopular action B are thrown out. So representative democracy is going to tend to favor majority interests more than judicial power, where a minority congruent official gets to stay in office for 2 periods. So if there's a high chance that minority interests outweigh majority interests, then judicial power might actually be better for society than representative democracy. For intermediate cases where the chance that minority interests outweigh majority interests is only moderate, then representative democracy is optimal. And in the case where majority interests are extremely likely to outweigh minority interests, then direct democracy is best. But let me close with one implication of this analysis, which is that what we might like to try to set up is some kind of separation of powers. We might like to have simultaneously some officials who are accountable and other officials who are not accountable, depending, and we want to assign decisions to the accountable or non-accountable decisions depending on how likely it is that minority interests will be dominating. Suppose that we had suppose we had an indication that minority interests were very important. Well, those decisions we would like to have taken by judges, by unaccountable officials. And that is, that's precisely the kind of system that we have in many democracies around the world. If there is indication that a minority's rights are likely to be violated, many democracies take the final decision out of the hands of the elected officials and put the final decision in the hands of courts. And the logic for doing that is exactly the one that I've laid out, that we expect that unaccountable officials, judges, are more likely to take into account the minorities' interests than the majorities when those minority interests are particularly important. So that's an indication of the kind of conclusion about democratic societies that this sort of analysis can yield. I hope that this brief introduction to the economic analysis of democratic constitutions perhaps whets your appetite for going into the matter further. And with that observation, let me thank you for your attention.
Come vi dicevo, appunto
As I told you, this was a rather abstract presentation where, in a simplified way, as economists often do, well, economists simplify issues which in fact are extremely important. So here we have a presentation, a simplified presentation focusing on three pillars, P and pi and Q. And the measure of these parameters shows what system works better. Now, this type of reasoning, which simplifies a very complex reality, is very useful to understand very complex issues. Let's speak about the experience of government Monti here in Italy. In that case, we delegated some people, or it was like judges, because those were non-accountable people. Mr. Monti was life senator, so he had no problems of being re-elected, and his government was not subject to any assessment, to any re-election. So we may think that behind that choice there was the idea that we were in a situation where people could not know what choices were best, and where P, that is the awareness about the right decisions to be taken, was very low, and where these people who were given the office, actually who were appointed in government, in fact were congruent and in line with the right decision. But then we know that different things happen, because Government Monti in the end decided to be re-elected, and that changed the history. Another example, Jean-Claude Juncker, who perhaps will be the next European Commissioner or head of the Commission. Well, Juncker, there is a famous sentence where he says, politicians know very well what things have to be done, but they do not know how to be re-elected after making those choices, after taking those decisions. So that's a justification and an excuse that politicians very often use in order not to do what they should do. The fact that they have low pies instead of having a queue close to zero. But probably there are other ways in order for our representative democracies to flourish better. That is, for example, to give better information. And this is exactly what we try to do in this festival, so that we spread the news, we spread information, we spread knowledge, so that we know if the choices and the actions taken are the right one. That is just to say that the things discussed here may seem abstract, but in fact they are very important. Now, we don't have a lot of time for questions, but let's have a couple of questions. Please speak in the microphone. No, sorry. It's me. I decide who takes the floor. Sorry.
What's your opinion about term limits? Your model is set up as if there were a term limit at the end of the second term. And second question, you assume that politicians do not learn by doing their job, but they actually do. We don't know if they actually learn something good while being in power, or if they actually build up a competence for building up entry barriers. So how would your model be complicated by this issue?
You want to answer immediately, or do you want to take a few? No, I'll answer immediately.
Okay, please.
I didn't have a chance to talk about term limits. That is something that we've looked into in detail. In this very simple model, the model as I laid it out, there actually is no advantage to term limits because I'm assuming that the public gets a payoff of 1 for each correct decision, a payoff of 0 for each incorrect decision, and that's the end of the story. But in a more complicated model where a richer set of outcomes is possible, term limits might be desirable as a way of limiting risk. So one difficulty with putting a politician into office for a very long period of time, whether it's through a long-term appointment or through many re-elections, is that that politician will be taking decisions which prove in the long run to be disastrous for society. Term limits are a way of limiting that risk. Now you also asked what about learning by doing on the part of politicians? Do they get better when they've had more experience? And that's also something that we've looked into. I didn't talk today about how long these periods are. But in fact, you don't want to have periods that are too short, because within a very short period, a politician doesn't have the chance to develop her skills. So the period length that I was taking as given today itself is subject to choice. in the Constitution. On the one hand, we don't want it too short, because then we'll be having re-elections before politicians have fully developed. On the other hand, we don't want it to be too long, because then we run the risk of having politicians in office who are very non-congruent with society. So the period length itself will be determined by the Constitution.
Yes.
Chiedere un parere.
Well, in Italy, in the past 2 years, a political movement has been pretty successful, and that movement believes that direct democracy is very important. It is indeed the future of our country. And they think that the introduction of technologies and a presumed greater awareness of the public, and also the possibility of expressing one's own vote through the internet, well, they think this political movement believes that this is very important and this is the future of the society. What do you think about this? Do you think that this could improve direct democracy?
Modern technologies certainly make it easier for the public to express their views. I'm not fully convinced that modern technology ensures that the views that the public expresses are terribly well informed. I think that the main risk with direct democracy is that the incentive for the individual citizen to really become well educated when it comes to political decisions is pretty low. Because elections are not held every day, we might educate ourselves about politicians and have reasonably well-informed views about whom to elect. But if we had to take political decisions every day the way politicians do, we would be overwhelmed. Modern technology is not going to solve that problem. In the end, I think for a large society to function well, many of the decisions are going to have to be delegated to representatives.
Very good. There are two more questions. I think we can take two more. Down there, yes.
Salve. Thank you for this great opportunity to understand better the public affairs. I would like to ask you a little thing. If nowadays lots of people that knows nothing about politics, about foreign affairs, about this model or this theory, how can we implement in their head the idea of a good government of the multitude of other people that think in the same way but never knows this model or other thing like this?
If I understand your question correctly, it sounds as though you're asking about direct democracy versus representative democracy. If most people are not terribly well informed, or if a lot of people are not terribly well informed about political decisions, public decisions, then it's only through representative democracy that we have a reasonable hope for decisions being correct. Now, why should representatives take the right decision? Well, I was arguing that they want to leave a legacy, and I think that can be a powerful motivation, and in countries where the press does its job, representatives are also given the incentive to act on behalf of the public, because if they don't, they'll be exposed by journalists. So either way, through legacy or through this parameter Q, the possibility that the public will find out whether the politicians have been doing their job, we're usually going to be better off with representatives making the decisions rather than the public making those decisions directly.
L'ultima domanda la prendiamo là in fondo, c'era ancora.
Microphone, please.
I like the model, how elegant it is, and it has some emerging dynamics which are quite interesting from the few number of parameters. But what is missing, in my opinion, and I would like to ask you how that would be implementable, is the political competition. So how can political competition emerge in this model where officers are homogeneous? And since I think this is what is determining the actual politics in Italy. So it's all about that competition, which is missing.
Okay.
You're right. Another simplification, actually an oversimplification of this model, is that the only point at which competition comes into the picture is at the time of re-election, where either the current politician gets back into office for another term or some other politician takes her place. But in reality, political competition gives us more than the opportunity to replace current politicians with other politicians. It gives the public a chance to choose between different ideologies. Now, I didn't have time to get into ideological competition today. That would not. Of course, that's extremely important for actual democracy, but it doesn't affect any of the conclusions that I was drawing from this analysis, and that's why for matters of simplicity, to keep the model manageable, I kept ideological competition out.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure we have many other questions to ask, but unfortunately the time is over. Some of you also want to go to the other event that will follow shortly. Really, thank you so much for this great lecture. And